They fired her because her shoes looked too poor for their fancy restaurant. But they didn't know the most feared man in the city had come there only to find her.
Before we get into it, type ready in the comments if you're here for the drama. And don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable Mafia love stories.
The first thing people noticed about Elena wasn't her face, it was the shoes. Not because they were loud or ugly or dirty, they were simply worn too many times for a place like Bellerose Dining. The black material near the toes had faded gray in places, and the soles were separating slightly at the edges, no matter how carefully she glued them back together every few weeks. Elena noticed people looking at them all the time. Customers glanced down when she refilled wine glasses. Co-workers noticed when she crossed the polished marble floor during dinner rush. Even the hostess had once stared at them for a second too long before saying quietly, "You know the manager hates when uniforms look messy." Elena had smiled politely and said, "I know." Then she kept working. Because shoes cost money, and right now, money went to rent, electricity, and the pharmacy receipt folded carefully inside her purse beside the little calculator she used almost every night. The restaurant opened at 4, but Elena arrived before noon most days. She helped unload deliveries when the kitchen was behind schedule. She polished silverware, folded napkins, refilled salt shakers, anything that earned extra hours. "You're here again?" Marissa asked one afternoon while tying her apron. Elena looked up from a stack of glasses she was drying. "They needed help." "They always need help," Marissa muttered, "and somehow you're always the one doing it." Elena only smiled faintly. The truth was simple. She couldn't afford not to. By 27, exhaustion had become part of her body. It lived in the ache behind her shoulders and the heaviness in her legs after 14-hour shifts. It sat behind her eyes when she woke up before sunrise and returned home long after midnight. But she never complained. Not out loud. Customers loved her because she remembered things. Extra ice in the lemonade, no onions on the pasta. The older man near the window who liked his coffee reheated twice before dessert arrived. "You're the sweetest waitress here," people told her all the time. And Elena always thanked them like the words mattered more than the tips. Sometimes they did. Because kindness was easier to survive on than humiliation. The dinner rush hit hard that Friday night. The restaurant filled quickly with wealthy couples, business meetings, expensive perfume, and the soft sound of piano music drifting through the dining room. Elena moved quickly between tables, balancing trays with steady hands despite the burning pain in her feet. "Table 7 needs another bottle." "Can you take patio too?" "We're short-staffed tonight." Every request landed on her shoulders, and every time she answered the same way. "Okay." Rick watched all of it from behind the front counter. He was the restaurant manager. Mid-40s, perfect suits, perfect hair, the kind of man who cared more about appearances than people, especially in a place like Bellerose. "This isn't a diner," he liked to remind the staff. "People come here for luxury." Luxury. Elena sometimes wondered if people like Rick had ever been truly tired before. Not the kind of tired fixed by sleep, the kind that followed you everywhere because your entire life depended on continuing anyway. "Move faster," Rick snapped as she passed by with 2 plates balanced on one arm. "I'm trying." "Try harder." The words didn't surprise her anymore. Nothing he said surprised her. What still surprised her was how normal everyone acted around it. The cooks ignored it. The servers avoided eye contact. The hostess pretended not to hear. Because Bellerose worked on silence. Silence kept jobs safe. Silence paid rent. Near 9 o'clock, Elena slipped briefly into the kitchen to grab another order. The heat hit her instantly, wrapping around her already exhausted body. One of the cooks glanced down as she passed. "Those shoes still alive?" he joked. A couple others laughed quietly. Elena looked down for half a second at the cracked sole near her left foot. "Barely," she admitted softly. "Why don't you buy new ones?" The question wasn't cruel, not really. That almost made it worse. She forced a small smile. "Working on it." The cook nodded like that answered everything. But Elena knew it didn't. Because people who had never counted coins at grocery stores never really understood what working on it meant. It meant choosing between gas or food that week. It meant pretending you weren't hungry because groceries had to last longer. It meant calculating every purchase 3 times before making it. It meant wearing shoes until they physically gave up. She grabbed the plates and returned to the dining room before anyone could ask more questions. The night kept moving. Orders came out late, customers complained, Rick grew sharper with every passing hour, and Elena carried all of it quietly like she always did. Near closing time, an elderly woman sitting alone near the back stopped Elena gently before she walked away from the table. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "you look exhausted." Elena blinked once, caught off guard by the kindness. "I'm okay." The woman studied her for a moment longer. "You remind me of my daughter," she said. "She worked too hard too." Elena smiled politely. "I'll bring your check?" But as she walked away, something tightened briefly in her chest, because nobody ever asked if she was tired. They asked for refills, for extra bread, for faster service, not if she was okay. The restaurant slowly emptied after 10. Glasses clinked softly into bins. Chairs scraped against the floor as staff began cleaning. Elena finally leaned against the service station for just a second, rubbing one hand against the back of her neck. Her feet throbbed, her shoulders burned, and when she glanced down again at the worn black shoes beneath her uniform, she noticed the sole on the left one peeling farther away than before. She crouched quickly and pressed it back into place with her thumb. "Don't fall apart yet," she whispered under her breath. The words sounded almost desperate, because if the shoes gave out completely, she didn't know what she would do. Behind her, Rick's voice cut through the quiet. "Elena." She stood immediately. "Yes?" Rick's eyes dropped briefly toward her feet before returning to her face. "We need to talk tomorrow before your shift." Her stomach tightened instantly. "About what?" "You'll find out tomorrow." Then he walked away. Just like that. No explanation, no reassurance. Only that cold, controlled tone that made her chest feel heavy before she even understood why. Elena stood there for a moment after he disappeared into the office. The restaurant around her buzzed softly with cleanup noises, but suddenly it all felt distant. Her eyes dropped slowly toward her shoes again. The peeling sole, the faded black fabric, the tiny crack near the toe she kept trying to hide, and for the first time all night, something colder than exhaustion settled into her chest. Fear. Bellerose Dining looked beautiful from the outside. That was the entire point. The gold lettering above the entrance gleamed under warm lights every evening, while expensive cars lined the street outside. Couples stepped onto the sidewalk dressed in designer coats and polished shoes, laughing softly as valets hurried forward to open doors for them. Inside, everything smelled expensive. Fresh flowers stood on every table. Crystal glasses reflected soft candlelight across the room. Piano music drifted quietly through hidden speakers, while servers moved carefully between tables like they were part of the performance itself. Rick loved that part. "People don't pay for food," he reminded the staff constantly. "They pay for atmosphere." Atmosphere. The word followed everything inside Bellerose. The lighting had to feel elegant. The servers had to look polished. The smiles had to feel effortless. And nothing, absolutely nothing, could remind customers that the people serving them were struggling human beings with real lives outside those walls. Especially Elena. The next afternoon, she arrived early again. Her feet still hurt from the double shift the night before, but she ignored it while tying her apron in the employee locker room. Around her, the other servers talked quietly while fixing makeup or adjusting their uniforms. "You know Rick's in a mood today," one girl muttered. "When isn't he?" "He's interviewing investors tonight." That explained it. Whenever wealthy guests visited, the pressure inside the restaurant became unbearable. Every plate had to arrive perfectly. Every chair had to align exactly. Every employee had to look like they belonged inside the fantasy Bellerose sold to rich people every night. Elena finished tying her apron and reached down quickly to press the loose sole of her shoe back into place again. Marissa noticed immediately. "You seriously need new shoes," she whispered. "I know." "I'm not trying to be rude," Marissa added carefully. "I'm just saying Rick notices things like that." Elena forced a small smile. "Rick notices everything." That part was true. Rick noticed wrinkled shirts, messy hair, uneven lipstick, tiny mistakes nobody else cared about. But he never noticed kindness, never noticed who stayed late to help close, never noticed who skipped breaks because the kitchen was overwhelmed, never noticed Elena carrying trays while her hands trembled from exhaustion. Only appearances mattered to him. Meeting in 5 minutes, his voice called from outside the locker room. Everyone straightened immediately. The staff gathered near the bar while Rick stood in front of them holding a clipboard against his chest. His suit was perfectly pressed as always. His smile wasn't. "Tonight is important," he said sharply. "We have guests spending more on dinner than some people make in a month." A few quiet laughs followed from the servers. Elena stayed silent. Rick's eyes moved across the group slowly. "I don't want distractions tonight," he continued. "No mistakes, no attitude, no sloppy presentation." His gaze stopped briefly on Elena's shoes, only for a second, but she saw it. And suddenly she became painfully aware of every crack in the leather. "If you look unprofessional," Rick said calmly, "customers notice." The room stayed quiet. Nobody defended her, nobody ever did. Because Belarus trained people to survive individually. If attention landed on someone else, you stayed grateful it wasn't on you. Dinner service began an hour later. The restaurant filled quickly with wealthy customers speaking loudly about vacations, investments, and business deals worth more money than Elena had ever seen in her life. One man complained because his wine arrived 30 seconds late. Another snapped his fingers for attention instead of speaking normally. A woman near the center table sent back her salad twice because the presentation felt messy. Elena handled all of it politely, always polite. "I apologize. I'll fix that right away." "Of course." The words came automatically now. At table 12, a man in an expensive navy suit glanced openly down at her shoes while she poured water. His wife noticed too. Her lips tightened slightly. "Do they not pay enough here for proper uniforms?" she asked casually. Not to Elena, about her. The husband chuckled softly. "Apparently not." Heat climbed into Elena's face instantly, but her hands stayed steady. "Can I get you anything else tonight?" she asked quietly. The woman looked at her for a second too long before answering. "No, that'll be all." Elena nodded once and walked away before they could say more. Behind her, she heard the woman lower her voice. "It ruins the atmosphere." The sentence hit harder than it should have, not because strangers judged her, she was used to that, but because they spoke about her like she wasn't standing right there, like poor people stopped being human once they wore a uniform. Near the kitchen doors, two younger servers stood whispering together. One glanced toward Elena. "I heard Rick's already upset about her shoes. She should just buy new ones. Maybe she can't afford them." A shrug. Then maybe Belarus isn't the place for her. Elena kept walking, because stopping would make it worse. Inside the kitchen, the atmosphere wasn't kinder. The cooks moved aggressively between stations, while heat and noise filled every corner. Rick entered moments later. "Table 16 is unhappy," he snapped immediately. "It's being fixed," Elena replied. "Well, fix it faster." "I already sent the replacement." Rick stepped closer. "You know what your problem is?" Elena stayed quiet. "You don't understand presentation." His eyes dropped toward her feet again. "Everything here reflects on the restaurant." The humiliation came quietly now, not loud enough to cause a scene, just controlled enough to make her feel small without giving anyone a reason to defend her. "I'm doing my best," she said softly. Rick gave a short, humorless laugh. "Your best isn't luxury." The words settled heavily between them. Around them, the kitchen staff pretended not to listen. But they heard everything. Everyone always heard everything. Elena lowered her eyes briefly. "Okay." Rick stared at her for another second before walking away. That was the thing about Belarus. Cruelty never arrived dramatically. It came in small cuts. Embarrassment disguised as professionalism. Judgment disguised as standards. Humiliation disguised as business. And after enough time, people stopped noticing the difference. By 9:30, Elena's feet hurt so badly she could barely feel her toes. Still, she kept moving. Table 7 needed dessert menus. Table 5 wanted another bottle. The hostess called out that patio needed help. So Elena moved faster, always faster. As she passed one of the mirrored walls near the dining room entrance, she caught sight of herself for half a second. Tired eyes, loose strands of dark hair escaping her ponytail, and those shoes, worn, faded, embarrassing. For the first time in months, shame hit her harder than exhaustion. Not because she believed Rick was right, because everyone else seemed to believe it too. A wealthy couple near the window laughed softly as she passed again. The man looked down toward her feet, then toward his date, then smiled. Elena looked away immediately. Something inside her chest tightened painfully. Not anger, not even sadness anymore. Just exhaustion. The deep kind. The kind that comes from trying to survive in places that constantly remind you that you don't belong there. And somewhere across the restaurant, Rick watched her again with cold, measuring eyes. Not seeing the hardest worker in the building, not seeing the woman carrying half the restaurant on tired shoulders, only seeing worn-out shoes that didn't fit the image he wanted to sell. Friday nights at Bellerose always felt heavier than the rest of the week. The restaurant filled faster, the music grew softer, the customers became richer, louder, more demanding, and Rick became unbearable. "Elena, table 6 is waiting." Elena, smile more. Elena, move faster. His voice followed her across the restaurant all evening like something sharp dragging behind her heels. By 8 o'clock, every table was full. Crystal glasses reflected warm candlelight, while expensive watches flashed beneath rolled-up sleeves. Conversations about private schools, luxury vacations, and investment deals drifted through the dining room in calm, polished voices. Elena moved through all of it quietly, refilling wine, delivering plates, clearing dishes before anyone had to ask. Her feet hurt badly now. Every step pressed the damaged sole farther apart beneath her left shoe, but she ignored it the same way she ignored everything else. Because surviving shifts at Bellerose meant learning how to disappear while still being useful. Near the center of the restaurant, a new group had just been seated at one of the premium tables. Elena recognized the type immediately. Old money. The kind that didn't need to speak loudly to make everyone around them nervous. 2 men in tailored suits. A woman covered in jewelry subtle enough to cost more than most cars. And another younger woman scrolling through her phone without looking at anyone around her. Rick personally walked them to their table. That alone said enough. "Take excellent care of them," he told Elena quietly afterward. "They're important." "Okay." "And Elena," his eyes dropped briefly toward her feet again, "be careful tonight." The words sounded polite. They weren't. Her stomach tightened slightly, but she nodded anyway and approached the table with menus balanced carefully against one arm. "Good evening," she said softly. "Can I start anyone with sparkling water or cocktails tonight?" The older woman barely looked at her. "Still or sparkling?" Elena asked gently. The younger woman glanced up from her phone first, then her eyes moved downward, toward Elena's shoes. She frowned slightly. The older man noticed the expression immediately. "What is it?" The younger woman leaned closer toward him and whispered something, too quietly for most people to hear. Not quietly enough for Elena. His eyes followed hers downward, straight to the worn black shoes beneath Elena's uniform. The small crack near the sole had opened wider during the rush. Elena instinctively shifted her foot backward. Too late. The man's expression changed instantly. Not disgust exactly, something colder. Disapproval. "We'll take sparkling," he said flatly. Elena nodded once. "Of course." She turned quickly and walked back toward the service station, her face growing warm beneath the restaurant lights. Behind her, she heard the younger woman laugh softly. "Seriously?" The older woman answered this time. "I told you standards everywhere are collapsing." Elena kept walking, faster now. Inside the kitchen, she gripped the counter for half a second longer than necessary while filling water glasses. Marissa noticed immediately. "You okay?" "Fine." "You don't look fine." Elena forced a quick smile. "Just tired." But the feeling in her chest wasn't exhaustion anymore. It was humiliation. The deep, quiet kind that settles under your skin and stays there. She returned to the table, carefully balancing the sparkling water bottles. The older man didn't thank her when she poured. Neither did the younger woman. Only the older woman looked directly at Elena. And even then, it wasn't really at her. It was at the shoes again, at the proof that someone poor had entered a place people like them considered exclusive. "How long have you worked here?" the woman asked suddenly. Elena looked up. "A little over 2 years." The woman took a slow sip of water. "You'd think after 2 years they could at least provide proper uniforms." The younger woman smiled into her wine glass. The older man didn't react at all. Elena kept her voice calm. "I'm sorry if there's a problem." The woman tilted her head slightly. "The problem isn't your service." A pause. "It's presentation." The sentence landed softly, almost casually. That somehow made it worse. Elena stood still for half a second, then nodded politely. "I understand." But she did understand. That was the problem. She understood exactly what they meant. Not professional enough, not elegant enough. Too poor for the image Bellerose wanted to sell. Rick appeared beside the table moments later like he had been waiting for it. "Is everything all right here?" he asked smoothly. The older woman smiled politely. "The service is fine." Fine. The kind of word wealthy people used when they wanted someone punished quietly. The woman glanced toward Elena's feet again. "But honestly," she continued, lowering her voice just enough to sound reasonable, "your staff presentation feels inconsistent with the atmosphere." Rick's posture stiffened slightly. "I apologize if anything seemed inappropriate." "Inappropriate?" the younger woman repeated softly. "Her shoes are falling apart." The words hung in the air now, no longer whispered, no longer subtle. Nearby tables began glancing over. Elena felt every pair of eyes immediately. Rick turned toward her slowly, and for one terrible second, she saw it happen. Not concern, not embarrassment for her. Calculation. He was already deciding how to protect the restaurant from looking bad. The older man adjusted his cufflinks calmly. "When people pay this much for dinner," he said, "they expect standards." Rick nodded quickly. "Of course." Elena stood frozen beside the table, holding an empty tray against her chest. No one defended her. Not the customers nearby pretending not to listen. Not the servers watching nervously from across the room. Nobody. Because everyone inside Bellerose understood the same thing. Image mattered more than people. Rick forced a tight professional smile toward the table. "I sincerely apologize. I'll handle it." Handle it. Elena felt the word like a warning. The older woman smiled faintly. "Thank you." Rick turned toward Elena then. "Come with me." His voice stayed calm, too calm. That was always worse. Elena followed him across the restaurant while silence spread quietly behind them. Not complete silence, the kind filled with whispers, with people pretending not to stare while staring anyway. She kept her head down as they entered the hallway leading toward the office. The moment the dining room doors swung shut behind them, Rick's expression changed completely. His smile disappeared instantly. "I warned you," he said coldly. Elena swallowed hard. "I know." "No, you clearly don't." She looked down automatically toward her shoes. The damaged sole had separated farther now, visible, embarrassing. "I'm trying to replace them," she said quietly. Rick laughed once under his breath. "Trying isn't good enough in this restaurant." Elena's throat tightened painfully. "I didn't think—" "That's the issue," he snapped. "You don't think about how this place looks." His eyes hardened. "You embarrassed this restaurant tonight." The words hit harder than they should have, not because she believed them, because part of her suddenly feared everyone else did too. Rick didn't let her speak again. The moment they stepped fully into the hallway outside the dining room, he folded his arms across his chest and stared at her like she had personally ruined the entire restaurant. "You know what Bellerose sells?" he asked coldly. Elena stood quietly holding the empty tray against her chest. "An experience," he answered before she could respond. "People come here because everything looks perfect." His eyes dropped toward her shoes again. "And then there's you." The words landed hard. Elena swallowed carefully. "I said I'm trying to replace them." Rick shook his head slowly like he was exhausted by her existence. "That's the thing about poor people," he muttered. "Always trying, never actually fixing anything." Her grip tightened slightly on the tray. The hallway suddenly felt smaller. Hotter. She looked down because looking at him somehow made it worse. "I work every shift you ask for," she said quietly. "I stay late. I cover for people. I'm doing my best." Rick let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "And your best still looks embarrassing." The sentence hit deeper than she expected, not because strangers had mocked her, because this man knew exactly how hard she worked, and still chose to humiliate her anyway. The dining room doors swung open behind them as a server hurried past carrying drinks. The girl glanced at Elena briefly before immediately looking away again. Nobody wanted involvement. Nobody wanted Rick's attention turning toward them instead. Rick noticed Elena's expression harden slightly. "What?" he asked. "Nothing." "No, say it." Elena shook her head immediately. "I didn't mean—" "That's another problem with you," Rick interrupted. "You walk around here acting grateful while secretly feeling sorry for yourself." Her chest tightened painfully. "That's not true." "Then explain this to me." He stepped closer. "How does someone work here for 2 years and still can't afford basic shoes?" The question wasn't really a question. It was humiliation stretched out slowly. Elena's face burned. "I have bills," Rick scoffed. "Everyone has bills." He gestured toward the dining room. "You think those customers want to spend hundreds of dollars eating beside someone who looks like she came from a shelter?" The words knocked the air from her lungs. For a second, she forgot how to respond at all. Rick saw it immediately, saw the hurt land, and instead of stopping, he kept going. "You know what your problem is?" he continued. "You don't belong in places like this." The hallway blurred slightly around the edges. Elena forced herself to breathe evenly. "I've never caused problems here." "No," Rick agreed coldly. "You just lower the standard every time you walk through the room." The dining room doors opened again, this time slower. Marissa stepped halfway into the hallway carrying a tray of empty glasses. She stopped the second she felt the tension. Rick glanced at her sharply. "What?" "Table 9 needs—" "Then handle it." Marissa nodded immediately, but before she disappeared again, her eyes flicked briefly toward Elena. Apologetic, powerless, gone. Rick exhaled slowly through his nose. "You know what's embarrassing?" he asked quietly. "Watching customers notice your situation before management does." Elena stared at the floor. The peeling sole of her left shoe suddenly felt enormous, visible, humiliating, like the entire restaurant had been staring at her feet all night. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Rick laughed again. "There it is." Her throat tightened. "What?" "That constant apology." His expression twisted slightly. "You think saying sorry fixes how you look?" The words felt cruel now in a way that wasn't even trying to hide itself anymore. He wanted her ashamed. That realization settled slowly and horribly into her chest. Not corrected. Ashamed. The dining room behind them remained busy, but people had started noticing. A few customers glanced toward the hallway each time the doors swung open. Servers whispered near the bar. The atmosphere had shifted, and Rick didn't care. In fact, somehow the attention seemed to encourage him. "Nay!" He stepped back slightly and looked her over from head to toe. "The saddest part," he said. "You probably thought nobody noticed." Elena felt her eyes sting immediately. She blinked hard. "Not here. Don't cry here." "I was going to replace them after this paycheck," she said softly. Rick shrugged. "And until then what? Customers just pretend not to see it?" She stayed silent. "Do you know how much effort goes into building a place like Belarus?" he continued. "The image, the reputation, the clientele." His voice sharpened slightly. "And then one waitress walks around looking like she can't afford dinner here." The sentence cut deeper than anything before it. Because she couldn't afford dinner there, not even close. Rick knew that too. The realization made the humiliation feel even uglier. The hallway doors opened once more. This time, 2 servers stepped through together carrying wine bottles. Both slowed slightly when they saw Elena standing there. Rick didn't lower his voice, didn't stop. "If you're struggling that badly financially," he said loudly enough for them to hear, "maybe you should have found a job somewhere more realistic." The servers froze awkwardly for half a second, then quickly kept walking. Nobody said anything. Nobody ever said anything. Elena's eyes burned harder now. She stared down at the tray in her hands because looking anywhere else felt impossible. "I work hard," she whispered. Rick folded his arms again. "At Belarus, hard work isn't enough." The words echoed in the narrow hallway. Cold, precise, final. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Rick glanced toward the dining room again before making a decision. She saw it happen in real time, his expression smoothing out, his posture straightening, the public version of him returning. "Come with me," he said calmly. Fear settled instantly into her stomach. "Why?" "Because if customers notice the issue," he replied, "then customers deserve to see it handled." Her heart dropped. "No." Rick opened the dining room door. "Move!" The restaurant noise rushed over them immediately. Glasses clinking, soft music, conversations slowing one by one as people noticed Rick walking back into the room beside Elena. He guided her toward the center of the restaurant. Not aggressively. That somehow made it more humiliating. Every step felt heavier than the last. Servers stopped moving. Customers looked up openly now. Even the wealthy table that started everything watched with quiet interest. Rick stopped near the center aisle and turned toward her. "Since appearance clearly isn't something you take seriously," he said loudly, "let's make this simple." The entire room had gone almost silent. Elena felt dozens of eyes on her. Her chest tightened so hard it hurt. Rick pointed downward. "At Belarus, presentation matters." She couldn't breathe properly anymore. "Rick, show them." Her stomach dropped completely. "What?" "Your shoes." His voice stayed calm. "Since apparently you think they're acceptable." A few uncomfortable murmurs spread through the dining room. Elena stood frozen. Humiliation crashed over her so hard she thought it might physically knock her down. "Please," she whispered. Rick's expression hardened instantly. "Show them." Her hands trembled around the tray. Slowly, painfully, she stepped one foot forward. The damaged sole hung visibly loose now. The leather cracked beneath the restaurant lights. Someone at a nearby table actually laughed quietly. Another customer looked away uncomfortably. The older woman from earlier simply sipped her wine calmly, like this was entertainment. Elena wanted the floor to open beneath her. Rick shook his head slowly. "Unbelievable," he muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. "You come to work looking like this and expect us not to care?" Tears blurred Elena's vision now, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of these people, and not while they watched her like she was something dirty standing in the middle of their perfect restaurant. The silence inside Belarus felt unbearable, not completely quiet. Glasses still clinked softly, music still played somewhere in the background. But underneath it all was something heavier now. Attention. Every person in the restaurant was watching Elena stand there, with one damaged shoe slightly forward and tears gathering painfully in her eyes. Rick looked around the room slowly, as if waiting for everyone to fully understand the lesson he was trying to make out of her. "This," he said calmly, gesturing toward her feet, "is exactly what happens when employees stop respecting standards." Elena felt her throat tighten so badly it hurt. She could barely breathe. "Please," she whispered again. Rick ignored her completely. "We work hard to maintain a certain atmosphere here," he continued loudly. "People spend serious money to enjoy this restaurant." The older man at the wealthy table nodded slightly like he agreed. That somehow made it worse. "And when staff stop presenting themselves professionally," Rick said, "it reflects on all of us." All of us. As if Elena had somehow betrayed the restaurant by being poor. Her hands shook harder around the tray now. One tear finally slipped free despite her trying desperately to hold it back. Rick noticed immediately. His expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened. "Oh, don't do that," he said sharply. "Don't stand there crying like you're the victim." The sentence hit like a slap. A few customers shifted uncomfortably. One woman near the back quietly looked down at her plate, but nobody spoke. Nobody stopped him. Because Belarus was the kind of place where people preferred comfort over courage. Elena quickly wiped beneath one eye with trembling fingers. "I'm sorry," she whispered automatically. Rick laughed once under his breath. "Still apologizing." He stepped closer. "You know what the real problem is?" he asked quietly enough that only nearby tables could hear now. "You're embarrassing." The word settled into her chest heavily. Embarrassing. Not tired and not overworked, not struggling. Embarrassing. Rick shook his head slowly. "I gave you chances, extra shifts, flexibility, and this is how you show up?" Elena stared at the floor. Because if she looked at the customers watching her, she thought she might completely fall apart. "I needed the hours," she said softly. "And now you need a different job." The room seemed to freeze around her. Elena looked up finally. "What?" Rick's face stayed cold. "You heard me." For a second, she genuinely thought she misunderstood. Her voice cracked badly. "You're firing me?" Rick folded his arms. "You clearly aren't suited for this environment." A sharp ringing filled her ears. No, 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 not this, not tonight. Rent was due in 5 days. The electric bill already sat unopened on her kitchen table because she had been avoiding looking at the number again. Her mother's medication needed refilling next week. And now... "Please," she said quickly, panic slipping into her voice for the first time. "I can fix it. I'll buy new shoes. I just need..." "You need professionalism," Rick interrupted coldly. "I work harder than anyone here." The words escaped before she could stop them. Real silence followed that. Not polite silence, dangerous silence. Rick stared at her for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "You really believe hard work excuses looking like this?" Elena's chest rose unevenly now. "I've covered shifts every weekend for months, and you were paid for them." "I stay late every night." "Again," Rick said calmly. "That's your job." Marissa stood frozen near the service station holding a tray against her chest. Elena saw the horror in her face, but still, nothing. Nobody moved. Rick stepped back slightly and straightened his suit jacket. "We're done here." The finality in his voice broke something inside her. Just like that. 2 years, gone, no warning, no meeting, no dignity, only humiliation served publicly in front of strangers eating expensive dinners. Rick held his hand out. "Apron." Elena stared at him. The tears came harder now, no matter how much she tried stopping them. Her fingers shook violently as she untied the black apron from around her waist. The room blurred. She folded it automatically because habit still lived in her body even while her heart shattered inside her chest. Rick took it without thanks. "Collect your things and leave." Every word felt rehearsed, emotionless, efficient. Like throwing her away was no different than clearing an empty table. Elena swallowed hard and nodded once because speaking suddenly felt impossible. She turned carefully toward the hallway leading to the employee lockers. Then Rick spoke again. "No." She stopped. "If you leave," he said calmly, "you leave through the front." Her stomach dropped instantly. The front. Through the dining room, through every stare, every whisper, every customer who had just watched her get destroyed. "Rick." Her voice barely existed now. "You represented this restaurant publicly," he replied. "You can leave publicly too." The cruelty of it settled slowly across the room. Even some customers looked uncomfortable now. But Rick didn't care. He cared about power. And right now, humiliating Elena made him feel powerful. Her hands hung uselessly at her sides. She felt hollow suddenly, like something inside her had collapsed completely. Then, slowly, painfully, she started walking. The dining room stretched endlessly in front of her. Every step echoed too loudly against the polished floor. Her damaged shoe scraped slightly with each movement. People stared openly now. Some with pity, some with discomfort, some with the detached curiosity wealthy people often had when witnessing someone else's suffering from a safe distance. The younger woman at the expensive table smirked faintly into her wine glass. The older woman simply watched. Cold, unmoved. Elena kept her eyes down because looking at faces made the humiliation unbearable. Near the service station, Marissa finally whispered softly, "Elena." But Elena couldn't stop. If she stopped moving, she knew she would completely break down right there in the middle of the restaurant. The front doors grew closer. Her vision blurred harder. She pushed through the entrance and cold night air hit her instantly. The city lights outside looked harsh after the soft golden glow of Belarus. Behind her, the restaurant doors closed. And just like that, she was outside, alone, jobless, humiliated. Elena stood on the sidewalk for one shaky second before her knees nearly gave out beneath her. She grabbed the metal railing near the entrance to steady herself. The tears came harder now, silent at first, then uncontrollable. People walked past her without slowing down. Cars moved through the street. Laughter drifted from nearby restaurants. The entire city kept moving while her life suddenly stopped. Her chest hurt so badly she pressed one trembling hand against it. What am I going to do? She whispered to herself. The question terrified her because she genuinely didn't know. No paycheck, no savings, no backup plan, only overdue bills waiting at home and a pair of ruined shoes standing beneath her on the sidewalk like proof of everything she had failed to outrun. For a long moment she just stood there crying quietly beneath the glowing Belarus sign. Broken, ashamed, and completely unaware that inside the restaurant, someone important had just walked through the front doors asking one very simple question. Where is Elena? Inside Belarus, the atmosphere slowly tried to recover. Music still played softly through hidden speakers. Wine glasses still reflected warm golden light across white tablecloths. Servers resumed moving between tables, though more carefully now, quieter than before. But something uncomfortable lingered in the room, the kind of tension people pretended not to notice after witnessing something ugly. Rick adjusted his suit jacket near the front counter and forced his professional smile back into place. Desserts are complimentary for table 12, he told the hostess smoothly, as if nothing had happened, as if a woman hadn't just left the restaurant crying, as if humiliation were simply another part of customer service. The older couple near the center table returned to their meals without another word. The younger woman scrolled through her phone again, occasionally smirking at something on the screen. Nobody mentioned Elena anymore. That was how places like Belarus worked. People moved on quickly from discomfort once it stopped happening directly in front of them. Near the service station, Marissa stood frozen for a moment longer than necessary. She didn't deserve that, she whispered quietly. Another server immediately shook his head. Keep your voice down. Marissa looked toward the front doors. She worked harder than anyone here. And now she's gone, he muttered. Don't make yourself next. The sentence silenced her instantly, because everyone inside Belarus understood the rules. Cruelty was acceptable. Questioning it wasn't. Rick straightened a stack of menus near the host stand while pretending nothing about the evening bothered him. In his mind, he had protected the restaurant, protected the image, and image mattered more than feelings. The front doors opened suddenly. Cold night air swept briefly across the dining room. At first, nobody reacted. Then people looked up, and the entire atmosphere changed, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. The kind of shift that happens when someone dangerous enters a room without needing to announce themselves. The man who stepped inside moved calmly, unhurried, his dark coat hanging perfectly against broad shoulders. He wasn't surrounded by security. He didn't need to be. Power followed him naturally. A second man entered behind him a few steps later, taller, watchful, the kind of person who scanned rooms automatically without seeming to move his eyes at all. Conversations throughout Belarus slowed, then stopped completely. Even customers who didn't recognize the man immediately felt it, that pressure, that stillness. The hostess near the front visibly straightened. Good evening, she said carefully. Do you have a reservation? The man looked at her once. Calm gray eyes, cold enough to silence her immediately. Adrian Volkov, someone whispered quietly near the bar. The name spread almost instantly, not openly, softly, like people were afraid saying it too loudly might somehow attract his attention. Rick looked up sharply from the counter, and for the first time all night, his confidence cracked slightly. Because he knew that name. Everyone with money knew it. Everyone connected to the city's business world knew it. Adrian Volkov wasn't just wealthy. He was the kind of man people avoided discussing directly. The kind connected to stories nobody confirmed out loud. Stories about powerful men disappearing after crossing him. About businesses collapsing overnight. About problems solving themselves once Adrian Volkov became involved. And right now, he was standing inside Belarus. The restaurant had gone completely silent now. Even the piano music somehow felt quieter. Adrian's gaze moved slowly across the room. Not curious. Assessing, like he already knew something was wrong before walking in. Rick immediately forced a smile and hurried forward. Mr. Volkov, he said smoothly, this is an unexpected honor. If we'd known you were coming. Where is Elena? The question cut straight through him. No greeting, no small talk. Just her name. Rick stopped mid-step. Around the dining room, several heads turned immediately. Marissa froze beside the service station. The wealthy table near the center looked suddenly uncomfortable. Adrian stood completely still, waiting for an answer. Rick blinked once. "I'm sorry?" "Elena," Adrian repeated calmly. "Your waitress." Something dangerous settled beneath the calmness in his voice. Not anger, certainty. Rick recovered quickly. "Oh." He laughed lightly, too lightly. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. She no longer works here." The room somehow became even quieter. Adrian's expression didn't change. "No longer?" Rick nodded quickly. "There was an issue with professionalism." Marissa stared at Rick like she couldn't believe he was saying it out loud. Adrian's eyes stayed fixed on him. "What kind of issue?" Rick forced another smile. "Presentation concerns. Belarus has certain standards." The second man standing behind Adrian shifted slightly. Not much, just enough to make Rick visibly nervous. Adrian remained calm. Too calm. "And Elena failed those standards?" he asked. Rick nodded again. "She embarrassed the restaurant in front of customers." At a nearby table, the older wealthy woman slowly lowered her wine glass. For the first time all evening, uncertainty appeared on her face. Adrian looked around the dining room once. His gaze moved across the customers, the servers, the uncomfortable silence hanging over everyone. Then his eyes returned to Rick. "How exactly?" he asked quietly. "Did she embarrass the restaurant?" Rick hesitated, only briefly. Her appearance wasn't appropriate for the environment. Adrian said nothing. Rick suddenly seemed eager to explain. "She came to work looking unprofessional, worn shoes, poor presentation, customers complained." There it was, the truth. Ugly and small and pathetic now that it had been spoken aloud. Several people in the dining room avoided eye contact immediately. Marissa looked sick. Adrian's face remained unreadable. But the stillness around him changed, sharpened. "Customers complained," he repeated softly. "Yes." "And your response was?" Rick swallowed. "We handled the situation internally." A long silence followed. Adrian glanced toward the front windows of the restaurant, toward the street outside, then back at Rick. "You fired her." The words weren't a question. Rick tried smiling again. "It was necessary for the image of the business." Image. The second the word left his mouth, something cold settled fully into Adrian's expression. Not rage, worse, disappointment, the kind powerful men feel when they realize someone beneath them has behaved stupidly. Around the restaurant, nobody moved, nobody spoke. Rick suddenly looked less confident beneath Adrian's gaze. "I assure you," he said carefully, "Belarus maintains very high standards." Adrian stepped slightly closer, and somehow the entire restaurant felt smaller because of it. "Tell me something," he said quietly. Rick nodded too fast. "Of course." Adrian's voice stayed calm. "When she was carrying your restaurant on exhausted shoulders every night." A pause. "Did her shoes bother you then?" Rick's face paled slightly. No one breathed, because suddenly everyone understood something terrifying. Adrian Volkov hadn't come to Belarus for dinner. He had come for Elena. Nobody inside Belarus seemed to know how to move anymore. The restaurant had fallen into a silence so complete that even the smallest sounds stood out sharply. A fork touching porcelain, ice shifting inside a glass, someone breathing too hard near the back tables. Rick stood frozen near the front counter, his confident smile completely gone now. Adrian Volkov remained calm. That was the frightening part. He wasn't shouting, wasn't threatening anyone. But the entire room felt trapped beneath the weight of his attention. Rick cleared his throat carefully. "Mr. Volkov, I think there's been some confusion." "There isn't," Adrian interrupted quietly. The words landed with absolute certainty. Rick swallowed. Adrian's gaze shifted briefly toward the dining room windows again, toward the sidewalk outside where Elena had disappeared minutes earlier. Then, back to Rick. "I came here for her," he said. The statement changed everything. Several customers exchanged quick looks immediately. Marissa stared openly now. Yeah. Even the wealthy table that had complained earlier looked unsettled. Rick forced a nervous laugh. "You know Elena?" Adrian looked at him without expression. "Yes." The single word felt heavier than anything else spoken all night. Rick's posture stiffened slightly. I wasn't aware she had connections to. She doesn't, Adrian said calmly. That's the point. Another silence followed, because nobody understood. Not fully, not yet. Adrian slowly removed his gloves, one finger at a time, his movements controlled and unhurried. The second man beside him remained near the entrance, watching the room carefully. Then Adrian spoke again. 3 months ago, he said quietly, someone important to me collapsed outside this restaurant. Rick blinked once. No one interrupted him. It was raining, Adrian continued. People walked past him for almost 20 minutes. The dining room remained completely still. He was older, sick, confused. Adrian's eyes hardened slightly. Most people assumed he was homeless. A few customers looked uncomfortable immediately. Marissa slowly lowered the tray she'd been holding against her chest. Adrian's gaze shifted briefly toward one of the tables, though it wasn't directed at anyone specifically. He asked for help, he said. Nobody stopped. The words carried something colder now, not anger, memory. Then Adrian looked back at Rick. Except Elena. Something tightened visibly in Marissa's face, because that sounded exactly like Elena. Adrian continued calmly. She brought him inside out of the rain. A pause. She gave him food without charging him, called an ambulance, and stayed beside him until they arrived. Rick said nothing. What could he say? Adrian's voice remained steady. She missed half her shift because she refused to leave him alone. One of the cooks near the kitchen entrance looked down immediately. The older, wealthy woman slowly set her wineglass onto the table. Adrian's eyes darkened slightly. Do you know what happened when the ambulance arrived? Nobody answered. She apologized, Adrian said quietly. The words settled heavily into the room. She apologized to your staff for causing inconvenience. Marissa covered her mouth briefly with one hand. Because yes, that sounded exactly like Elena too. Always apologizing, even while helping someone nobody else cared enough to notice. Rick shifted uncomfortably now. He cleared his throat. I wasn't aware of any of this. No, Adrian replied calmly. You weren't. The sentence cut deeper than yelling ever could have. Adrian stepped slowly farther into the restaurant. Every eye followed him. The man she helped was my uncle. Real understanding spread across the room instantly. Not just surprise, fear. Because suddenly, everyone grasped why Adrian Volkov had walked into Belarus personally, asking for a waitress by name. My uncle built most of my business before illness took pieces of him away, Adrian said. His memory isn't reliable anymore. Some days he forgets where he lives. His expression remained unreadable. But he remembered her. The words landed softly, almost gently. For weeks, Adrian continued, he talked about a waitress who treated him with dignity while everyone else looked away. The room felt unbearably small now. Adrian glanced toward the front doors again. I intended to thank her tonight. Rick's face lost what little color remained. Marissa looked like she might cry herself. The wealthy couple who complained earlier avoided looking at each other completely now. Adrian's gaze returned slowly to Rick. Instead, he said quietly, I walked in just in time to learn you threw her out because she looked poor. Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Rick finally tried speaking again. Mr. Volkov, Belarus has certain expectations and she failed them because her shoes were worn. Rick hesitated. The silence after that hesitation said enough. Adrian nodded once slowly. I see. 3 simple words. But something about them made Rick visibly nervous. I didn't realize she was important to you, he said quickly. Adrian's expression changed slightly then. Not softer, worse, disappointed. You still don't understand, he said. Rick stopped talking immediately. Adrian looked around the restaurant once more. At the expensive tables, the polished glasses, the customers who had watched Elena cry without saying a word. Then his gaze returned to Rick. She was important before I ever walked through that door. The sentence settled across the entire room like judgment. Marissa lowered her eyes instantly. A man near the back table quietly shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Because suddenly, Belarus no longer looked elegant. It looked ugly, small, cruel. Rick opened his mouth again carefully. We were only trying to maintain a professional atmosphere. Adrian almost smiled at that. Almost. You humiliated a woman who worked herself exhausted for this place, he said calmly, all because rich people didn't like looking at poverty while eating dinner. Nobody defended the restaurant now. Nobody. Because hearing it spoken aloud stripped away all the polished excuses. There was no professionalism here, no standards, only cruelty disguised as luxury. Adrian reached into his coat slowly. Rick visibly tensed, but Adrian only removed a folded receipt. He placed it carefully onto the counter. Marissa recognized it immediately. An old hospital receipt, dated 3 months earlier. At the bottom was Elena's signature beside a payment amount, a small one, $87. Rick stared at it in confusion. Adrian's voice stayed quiet. She paid for my uncle's medication herself that night because the pharmacy refused to release it without payment. The room froze completely. She didn't know who he was, Adrian continued. She expected nothing in return. Rick looked physically ill now. Adrian glanced down at the receipt once before speaking again. And tonight, a pause. You fired her over shoes she probably couldn't replace because she spent money helping someone she didn't even know. The truth landed brutally, cleanly, final. Marissa turned away sharply, wiping at her eyes. One of the cooks muttered something under his breath that sounded ashamed. And Rick. Rick finally understood the scale of the mistake sitting in front of him, but it was too late. Far too late, because Adrian Volkov hadn't come to Belarus looking for conflict. He had come to repay kindness, and instead, he found out the woman who showed more humanity than everyone else in the building combined had just been publicly destroyed for being poor. The silence inside Belarus no longer felt elegant. It felt exposed. Every polished surface in the restaurant suddenly seemed fake beneath the weight of what Adrian had just revealed. The candlelight, the piano music, the carefully arranged flowers on every table, all of it now looked like decoration covering something rotten underneath. Rick stood near the front counter staring at the hospital receipt like it might somehow disappear if he looked long enough. $87. A waitress with damaged shoes had spent money she clearly didn't have helping a stranger while the people around her ignored him. And hours later, Belarus humiliated her for being poor. Adrian watched Rick quietly. That calmness frightened people more than shouting would have, because men like Adrian Volkov didn't lose control publicly. They simply decided things, and once decisions were made, consequences followed. Rick finally forced himself to speak. Mr. Volkov, if I'd known the situation. You would have treated her differently? Adrian interrupted. Rick hesitated. That hesitation answered everything. Adrian nodded once slowly. Exactly. The older wealthy man near the center table shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His wife suddenly seemed very interested in her untouched wine glass. Nobody wanted Adrian's attention turning toward them now. Unfortunately for them, it already had. Adrian's gaze moved calmly across the dining room. You complained about her shoes, he said, not loudly, but the sentence landed directly on the wealthy table anyway. The younger woman stiffened immediately. The older man cleared his throat. We simply expressed concerns regarding the restaurant atmosphere. Atmosphere, Adrian repeated softly. The word almost sounded amusing coming from him. The older woman lifted her chin slightly. There are standards in places like this. Adrian looked at her for a long moment, then asked quietly, and kindness falls below those standards? The woman said nothing, because there was no answer that didn't make her sound cruel. Adrian stepped farther into the dining room now. The entire restaurant followed him with nervous eyes. Tell me, he continued calmly, when you looked at her tonight, what exactly bothered you? Nobody spoke. Her shoes? A pause. Or the reminder that someone serving your food might be struggling more than you're comfortable seeing. The younger woman lowered her eyes immediately. The older man looked irritated now, but not confident enough to argue. Adrian's voice remained steady. She worked herself exhausted in this building while people mocked her quietly over dinner. His gaze shifted toward Rick, and management encouraged it. Rick swallowed hard. That's not fair. Adrian looked at him. For the first time all evening, Something sharper appeared beneath the calmness. "Fair?" he repeated softly. The single word made Rick visibly nervous. Adrian gestured slightly toward the dining room. "You publicly humiliated a woman making minimum wage because wealthy customers didn't enjoy looking at worn shoes." His eyes hardened. "And you're talking to me about fairness." Nobody moved, not even the servers, because suddenly everyone inside Belarus realized the balance of power had changed completely. Rick was no longer controlling the room. Adrian was, and Adrian already knew exactly what kind of people they were. The second man standing near the entrance finally stepped forward quietly. "Sullivan," Adrian said without looking away from Rick. "Yes?" "How many restaurants does Belarus Hospitality own?" Sullivan answered immediately. 7 in the city, 12 total." Several employees exchanged nervous glances. Rick's face tightened. Adrian nodded once. "And labor complaints?" Sullivan opened a small tablet calmly. 3 unresolved investigations in the last 18 months. A pause. "Mostly unpaid overtime and hostile workplace reports." Marissa looked stunned. Rick immediately snapped, "Those complaints were dismissed." "Settled," Sullivan corrected calmly, "not dismissed." The room grew even quieter somehow. Adrian looked around slowly at the servers standing frozen beside the walls. 12-hour shifts, he said quietly. No overtime pay. No breaks during double shifts. Several employees looked down immediately, because he was right. Rick tried recovering control. "Every employee here chooses to work at Belarus." Adrian's gaze shifted back to him. "People choose survival," he said coldly. "That's not the same thing." The sentence hit the room hard, because everyone there understood it, especially the staff. Marissa's eyes filled slightly. One of the line cooks looked physically ashamed now. Rick straightened his posture again, desperate to regain authority. "With respect, Mr. Volkov, this is still my business." "No," Adrian said calmly. "It isn't." Confusion crossed Rick's face. Adrian reached into his coat again and removed his phone. One brief motion, one number dialed. Then, "Pull Belarus hospitality funding." Rick went pale instantly. The older wealthy man near the center table looked up sharply now. Adrian continued speaking into the phone calmly. "All of it." A pause. "Effective immediately." Rick stepped forward. "You can't just—" Adrian ended the call and looked at him. "I can." The room froze, because everyone there suddenly understood something terrifying. Belarus existed because investors supported it, and Adrian Volkov clearly held enough power to make those investors disappear overnight. Rick's composure finally cracked completely. "You're destroying a business over one waitress?" Adrian stared at him for a second, then answered quietly, "No." A pause. "I'm exposing what kind of business this already was." The sentence landed like a final judgment. The wealthy customers who laughed earlier now sat in complete silence. Not one of them defended the restaurant anymore. Not one. Because cruelty always looked uglier once someone powerful forced people to see it clearly. Sullivan's phone buzzed softly. He glanced down once. "First investor already withdrew," he said calmly. Rick looked sick. "That's impossible." "No," Adrian replied. "What's impossible is expecting decent people to keep financing humiliation disguised as luxury." The hostess near the front quietly wiped tears from beneath her eyes. One of the servers finally spoke up softly. "She worked every shift nobody wanted." Rick turned toward him sharply. "Stay out of this." But the fear inside the room had shifted direction now. People weren't afraid of Rick anymore. The server swallowed hard. "She covered for everyone," he continued quietly. "Even when she was sick." Another server nodded slowly. "She skipped breaks all the time." Marissa finally stepped forward. "You made her feel ashamed for being poor." Rick looked around wildly now. "You're all overreacting." But nobody agreed with him anymore. Because Adrian had done something dangerous. He had forced the room to look honestly at itself, at the whispers, the mocking, the silence, at the way everyone watched a hardworking woman get destroyed because her shoes embarrassed wealthy people during dinner. Adrian looked toward the front doors. toward the sidewalk outside where Elena had walked away crying minutes earlier. Then, back at Rick one final time. "You thought she looked small tonight," he said quietly. The restaurant remained completely still. Adrian's eyes hardened fully now. But after this, a pause. Nobody in the city will remember her as the embarrassment. His gaze locked onto Rick. "They'll remember you." Elena had walked 3 blocks before the tears finally slowed enough for her to breathe properly again. The cold night air burned against her cheeks, but she barely noticed it. Her thoughts were louder than the city around her. Rent, bills, her mother's medication. The words repeated endlessly in her mind while she stood beneath a flickering streetlight, clutching a small white envelope against her chest. Her final paycheck. Rick had shoved it into her hands right before she left. No apology. No thank you for 2 years of exhausting work. Just a folded envelope and a cold, "Good luck." Elena stared down at it now with trembling fingers. It felt too light. Not enough money to fix anything. Not enough to replace the shoes that destroyed her life tonight. A bitter laugh almost escaped her throat at the thought. Destroyed over shoes. The humiliation replayed over and over in her head no matter how hard she tried stopping it. Show them. The memory made her stomach twist painfully. She could still feel dozens of eyes staring at her in the middle of the restaurant, still hear the soft laughter, still see Rick looking at her like she was something embarrassing standing under expensive lights. Elena quickly wiped beneath her eyes again. She needed to stop crying. People were walking past her on the sidewalk now, barely glancing in her direction. A couple stepped around her without slowing down. Someone across the street laughed loudly at something she couldn't hear. The city kept moving. It always did, even when your entire life suddenly collapsed. Her phone buzzed weakly inside her purse. Mom calling. Elena stared at the screen for a second before declining it. She couldn't do that conversation yet. Couldn't pretend everything was fine while trying not to fall apart on a sidewalk outside Belarus. She leaned back lightly against the cold brick wall behind her and closed her eyes for one dangerous second. Just breathe. Figure it out later. That was what she always did. Survive the moment first. Panic later. A black car slowed quietly near the curb across the street. Elena didn't notice. The engine idled softly for a moment before the back door opened. Adrian stepped out alone. No dramatic entrance. No security surrounding him now. Just a tall man in a dark coat crossing the street with calm, measured steps while the city moved around him. He spotted her immediately. Not because she stood out, because she looked exactly like someone carrying too much weight alone. Elena sensed movement nearby and looked up quickly. The second she recognized the man approaching, confusion crossed her face. She had seen him before, inside Belarus. The room had gone silent when he walked in. Even Rick looked afraid of him. Elena instinctively straightened slightly. "Sir," she said automatically, wiping quickly beneath her eyes again. Adrian stopped a few feet away from her, close enough now to notice details. The redness around her eyes, the way she held the paycheck envelope too tightly, the damaged shoes still barely holding together beneath her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Adrian looked at the envelope in her hands. "They paid you already." It wasn't a question. Elena glanced down briefly. "Yes." Her voice sounded small from crying. Adrian's expression remained unreadable. "They fired you publicly." Again, not a question. Elena swallowed hard. "Yes." The humiliation returned instantly just saying the word aloud. Adrian studied her quietly for a moment longer. Most people looked at crying women with discomfort or pity. He didn't. He looked at her like he was trying to understand how someone could survive this much cruelty and still remain gentle afterward. "I'm sorry," Elena said suddenly. The words slipped out automatically. Adrian's brow lowered slightly. "For what?" She blinked once. I don't know." The honesty of it almost broke her again, because apologizing had become instinct. "Sorry for existing. Sorry for struggling. Sorry for not being enough." Adrian noticed all of it immediately. "You helped my uncle," he said quietly. Elena looked confused for half a second. Then realization slowly crossed her face. "The older man?" "Yes." Her expression softened immediately despite everything else. Is he okay? Not how much money he had, not who he was, not why Adrian Volkov knew her name, just, is he okay? Something unreadable shifted briefly in Adrian's expression. He's alive because of you. Elena looked down quickly. I just called an ambulance. You stayed with him. She shrugged faintly. He was scared. The simplicity of the answer hit harder than dramatic kindness ever could have. Adrian glanced toward Belarus behind them. Warm light still glowed through the windows. A beautiful restaurant full of ugly people. You paid for his medication, he said. Elena immediately looked uncomfortable. It wasn't much. It was enough. Silence settled briefly between them. Not awkward, heavy. Elena shifted slightly against the wall. I didn't know who he was, she admitted softly. I know. That's why I did it. Her eyes widened slightly. No, she said quickly. I mean, I would have helped anyway, but I didn't know he was connected to someone like... She stopped herself. Like you. Adrian understood the unfinished sentence anyway. What kind of someone do you think I am? He asked calmly. Elena looked genuinely nervous now. People inside looked afraid when you walked in. A faint, almost smile touched the corner of Adrian's mouth. They usually are. The honesty startled a quiet breath out of her before she could stop it. Then her eyes lowered again. I'm sorry if this is awkward, she murmured. I probably look terrible right now. Adrian's gaze moved over her face carefully. Tired eyes, red cheeks from crying, exhaustion sitting deep beneath her skin. And somehow, dignity still intact despite everything Belarus tried to take from her. No, he said quietly. You don't. The words settled into her chest strangely, because nobody had looked at her kindly all night. Elena tightened her grip slightly around the paycheck envelope. I'll figure something out, she said softly, mostly to herself. Adrian watched her for a second. You're worried about money. The statement embarrassed her instantly. A little. He looked down briefly at the worn shoes beneath her feet, then back at her face. You spent your own money helping a stranger while struggling yourself. Elena shrugged again. He needed it more. The answer came so naturally that Adrian almost looked frustrated by it, not at her, at the world that taught someone like Elena to constantly give while receiving almost nothing in return. A cold breeze moved between them. Elena rubbed her hands lightly together. Without hesitation, Adrian removed his gloves and held them toward her. She blinked. What? Your hands are freezing. I'm okay. You don't have to keep saying that. The sentence hit unexpectedly hard, because she did keep saying it, always, even when she wasn't okay at all. Slowly, carefully, Elena accepted the gloves. They were warm, soft, expensive enough that she immediately became nervous holding them. You don't owe me anything, she said quietly. Adrian looked at her steadily. This isn't debt. A pause. It's respect. The word settled deeply somewhere inside her chest. Respect. Rick humiliated her publicly. Customers mocked her. Co-workers stayed silent. And now, somehow, the most dangerous man she had ever met was standing in front of her, treating her with more dignity than anyone else had all night. Adrian glanced toward the car waiting across the street. Then, back at her. You're not going home tonight worried about rent? Elena immediately shook her head. I can't take charity. This isn't charity either. Her brow tightened slightly. Then what is it? Adrian stepped slightly closer, not threatening, certain. A chance to start over, he said quietly. Somewhere people understand your value before they look at your shoes. And for the first time since walking out of Belarus crying beneath all those staring eyes, Elena felt something unfamiliar push through the humiliation still crushing her chest. Hope. 3 weeks later, Elena stood in front of a mirror and almost didn't recognize herself. Not because she suddenly looked like someone else, because for the first time in years, she looked rested. The dark circles beneath her eyes had faded. The constant tension she used to carry in her shoulders was gone, or at least quieter now. Even the way she stood had changed slightly, straighter, less guarded. The apartment around her was small but warm, sunlight spilling softly across hardwood floors and cream-colored walls. No leaking faucet, no flickering lights, no stack of overdue envelopes waiting on the kitchen table. Safe. That word still felt unfamiliar sometimes. Elena adjusted the sleeve of her coat and glanced down at the shoes on her feet. New ones, simple black leather, comfortable, clean. Not expensive enough to feel unreal, but good enough that she no longer worried about holes opening in the soles during rainstorms. The memory hit her unexpectedly then. The dining room at Bellerose, people staring, and Rick's voice cutting through the restaurant while she stood there trying not to cry. Her chest tightened briefly before another memory replaced it. You don't have to keep apologizing for surviving. Adrian had said that to her 4 days ago during dinner. Not romantically, not softly, just honestly. And somehow honesty from him always landed deeper than comfort from anyone else. A quiet knock interrupted her thoughts. You ready? Marissa asked from the doorway. Elena turned quickly. Marissa smiled immediately. There she is. Elena laughed softly under her breath. You say that every time you see me now. Because you keep looking healthier every time. Marissa stepped fully into the apartment carrying 2 coffees and handed one over carefully. Neither of them worked at Bellerose anymore. After everything became public, most of the staff left within days. Once people stopped being afraid of Rick, stories started surfacing quickly. Unpaid hours, public humiliation, threats, mistreatment. The restaurant collapsed faster than anyone expected. Turns out expensive decorations couldn't survive ugly truths forever. You nervous? Marissa asked. Elena took a small sip of coffee. A little. That's normal. Today mattered, not because she was returning to Bellerose. She wasn't. That place no longer existed in any way that mattered. Today was the opening of Volkov House, a new restaurant on the opposite side of the city. Smaller than Bellerose, warmer. No dress code forcing employees to hide poverty behind fake smiles. No managers screaming across dining rooms. No customers allowed to treat workers like furniture. Adrian had funded the entire thing quietly. Not for publicity, not for headlines. Simply because Elena once admitted over coffee that restaurants didn't have to be cruel to succeed. So he built one that wasn't. And somehow, he put her in charge of it. The thought still felt unreal sometimes. You know they already love you there, right? Marissa asked. Elena looked down briefly. They barely know me. They know enough. That was true too. The staff Adrian hired had heard what happened at Bellerose. Everyone in the city had by now. The story spread quickly once powerful people started talking about it openly. The waitress fired for being poor. The Mafia boss who walked in asking for her by name. The restaurant that disappeared weeks later. People whispered about Adrian Volkov with fear. But when they talked about Elena, they spoke differently, with respect. Marissa glanced toward the clock. You should go, she said gently. He's waiting. Elena rolled her eyes softly. He's not waiting. Marissa smirked. Elena, that man rebuilt an entire business model because you once looked sad describing toxic kitchens. A reluctant laugh escaped her. That sounds dramatic. It is dramatic. Another knock sounded lightly at the door before Elena could answer. Marissa immediately grinned. See? Elena opened the door. Adrian stood outside exactly as calm and composed as always, dark coat perfectly fitted, one hand resting casually in his pocket. But his eyes softened slightly the second they landed on her, and Elena noticed that immediately now. Little things, the way his expression changed around her, the way his voice lowered slightly when speaking directly to her, the way he always looked at her like she deserved space instead of apologizing for taking it. You're late, she said quietly. A faint, almost smile touched his mouth. By 30 seconds. Marissa snorted softly behind her. I'm leaving before this becomes unbearably attractive. Elena immediately flushed. Adrian looked entirely unaffected. Good decision, he replied calmly. Marissa laughed while walking toward the hallway. See you both there. Then she disappeared. Silence settled briefly between them. Not awkward, never awkward anymore. Adrian's gaze moved slowly over Elena once, not assessing, admiring. You look rested, he said. The simple observation warmed her more than compliments ever had. I slept. Good. His answers were always short like that, but somehow they still carried weight. Elena grabbed her coat fully and stepped outside, locking the apartment behind her. The city air felt crisp around them. Alive. Adrian walked beside her toward the waiting car. No rushing, no pressure, just steady presence. You know, Elena said quietly after a moment, I used to hate walking into restaurants. Adrian glanced at her. I know. I always felt... She searched for the right word. Observed. His jaw tightened slightly. People can be cruel when they think someone has less than them. Elena nodded. But now... She looked ahead at the street stretching in front of them, at the future waiting somewhere beyond it, at the version of herself she almost lost inside Belarus. Then she smiled softly. Now I think maybe they'll see me differently. Adrian opened the car door for her calmly. No, he said. Elena paused. His eyes held hers steadily. Now you'll see yourself differently. The words settled deep inside her chest, because that was the real change, wasn't it? Not the clothes, not the apartment, not even the new restaurant. It was the way she no longer folded inward while speaking, the way she stopped apologizing every 5 minutes, the way she finally understood kindness and weakness were not the same thing. Adrian waited patiently beside the open car door. Elena looked at him for one long second. This feared man the city whispered about. The man everyone stepped aside for. The man who opened a door when everyone else watched her disappear. Then she got into the car. Not as the poor waitress people mocked beneath restaurant lights, not as the girl ashamed of worn shoes and empty pockets, but as someone seen, someone respected, someone whose future no longer depended on surviving cruelty quietly. Outside, the city moved endlessly around them while the car pulled away from the curb. And inside it, Elena sat a little straighter than before, head high, no longer invisible.
Thank you for listening all the way to the end. If you made it this far, comment a red heart below so I know you are here until the final page. And don't forget to subscribe for more emotional Mafia romance stories. Love, Lily.